This is the ROS Developers Podcast, episode 61.
The ROS Developers Podcast, the ROS Developers. The ROS Developers Podcast, the ROS Developers.
Hello, ROS Developers, and welcome to the ROS Developers Podcast, the podcast that gives you insights from the experts about how to program your robots with ROS. This is Ricardo from The Construct, and today I would like to dedicate the episode to those ROS developers that have tried to use ROS in Windows. Yes, if you are a Windows developer, then you know that there exists a version of ROS for it, so you don't have to change into Linux systems. So this episode is dedicated to you, and you will know why in a few seconds. But because today we are going to talk with the person behind the development of ROS for Windows. Yeah, amazing. But before going into that, let me remind you about our ROS Online Academy. Yes, at The Construct we have created an online academy named the Robot Ignite Academy, which is meant to teach you how to learn ROS and how to apply that to robots. It contains a ROS learning path for beginners where it starts by teaching you about Linux and Python for robotics, so you set the basis. And then we continue teaching you all the basics of ROS concepts to become a master of ROS. By the end, we conclude with another course that teaches you how to build your own robot, your own physical robot, and how to ROSify it. We teach you how to add control, how to create a simulation for it, so you can finally become a real ROS developer. I'll put the link to the Academy in the show notes, but basically it's www.robotigniteacademy.com. So now, it is my pleasure to introduce you to Lou Amadio. Lou is Principal Development Lead in the Core Operating Systems Group at Microsoft. Amazing title, amazing company. He is focusing on robotics and autonomous systems. I presume that role is the one that led him to get interested into ROS, but we are going to know more about this in this interview. Welcome to the podcast, Lou.
Well, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Oh, my pleasure, my pleasure. Going after this interview for a long time, and happily we have the chance to meet here at the ROSCon and have the time here to do the interview. Super happy.
I am as well.
Okay, so please tell to the audience, what is your experience with ROS? Because, I mean, for the audience, it's mostly based on Linux. So you are a guy from the Windows world. So what is your experience with ROS before we got a version of ROS for Windows?
Well, let me take you back in time a few years.
Okay.
Microsoft had a product called Robot Developer Studio.
Yes, I knew that. Amazing.
And I was a development lead on it.
Oh, I didn't know that.
Now, what you might not know is we actually were building a first-party robot a few years ago.
No, which one?
We didn't really talk about it, but if you actually look at some of our Microsoft research videos, you'll see a small little robot that was used as a development platform.
Okay.
So my background actually is in robotics.
Okay.
When that product was no longer being offered, it was divided into a couple of different groups, one of which was I was focusing on conference room robotics.
What? Sorry, can you repeat?
Conference room robotics.
Okay, conference room robotics.
Mostly on the research side.
Yeah.
After that, I went to work in the Windows IoT team, first focusing on maker solutions, and then focusing on industrial solutions for IoT.
Yeah.
Now, ROS on Windows started as a labor of love between a buddy of mine and I, where we wanted to work with robots again.
Okay.
We started working on a race car based on a Power Wheels racer. A sizable platform for building robots.
But which size?
It's toddler size. It's designed for toddlers to drive on.
Oh, okay.
So it's a fairly sizable system. because of that, we actually started to hear from customers around the same time that they wanted to use ROS on Windows. So it was a little bit of peanut butter and jelly at the time. So with one of the things we found is that a lot of customers were using ROS on Linux, doing research and development, and then when it came time to transfer that into the factory, warehousing, medical, they had a little bit of a mismatch between the system that they had been building on and their IT infrastructure. So a lot of customers have asked us to ask Microsoft to work with ROS on Windows.
Okay.
We had this work. Our leadership said, "Hey, let's see if there's some signal here." And at ROSCon last year, we came to ROSCon and said, "We did this prototype, a public preview. Is this something that the community is interested in?" And the response has been absolutely phenomenal. We have had so much interest in the project. We made it productized and we announced general availability in May of this past year.
Okay.
And we have been working with a number of customers who have been transitioning their projects from Linux to Windows for physical deployment.
Okay. Okay, what an amazing story. And so now I understand from the bottom. And also you mentioned about the Microsoft's Robotics Development Studio.
Yeah.
That I used on the past. So that was created even before ROS. So that was created, maybe it was ROS already existed at that time because I don't remember exactly the year. But at that time, when Microsoft Robotics Studio existed and was available, there was no common usage of ROS at all. So I think that I didn't knew about ROS, but I knew about Microsoft Robotics Development Studio.
Yeah, Microsoft Robot Studio started, I have to remember the time frame. But it did predate ROS, but they actually share a common ancestor.
Yes.
And shared a common programming model. That pub sub asynchronous hyper disconnected solution. So if you're familiar with RDS, ROS is actually a natural migration.
Yes, that's right. Now that you mentioned RDS, means Robotics Development Studio.
Oh.
Yes. For the listeners. But we at the construct we produce a tool that is called the ROS Development Studio, and then we were calling it RDS also at the beginning, but then it was colliding with the old ROS Robot Development Studio by Microsoft, so we had to change the name to ROSDS instead of RDS, just because of your product, just in order to not collide the names and not confuse the people. So
that makes sense.
The RDS of Microsoft is no longer available, isn't it?
No, it's no longer available.
It's a shame because it was a very nice product and it was ahead of its time. It was ahead of its time. Well, but that's another story. It's not the one for this podcast today. So then you mentioned. So you answered here 2 of my questions in your previous answer. So that's so. Now, I met you last year at the ROSCon, and there's where you showed me the prototype that you had of Microsoft working with ROS. And then, can you explain to the audience what was able to do that version of ROS for Windows at that time?
Sure. So last year at ROSCon, we had demonstrated ROS on Windows on a Turtlebot using Windows machine learning, which was an extension to our Direct 3D pipeline, which allows a hardware accelerated machine learning inferencing. Okay. So we were running a Onyx model on hardware that the robot would use a fusion of LiDAR and ML to point the robot back and forth. It was a relatively simple demo, but it showed not only ROS on Windows, but some benefits of using Windows for ROS.
Okay. And since then, what has been improved? What can we expect of the current version of ROS on Windows?
So, with the current version, we've productized all of the code, so making sure that we removed some of the duct tape and baling wire that we had for that prototype. We've also upstreamed all of our changes. There's not a fork of ROS for Windows. We are building directly out of mainline. So this was ROS 1. We've also since then have made ROS 1 and ROS 2 coexist in the same environment, so that when you install the ROS 2 chocolatey packages, that they don't collide with the ROS 1 chocolatey packages.
So you can have on the same Windows, you can have both systems at the same time.
Correct. They're currently isolated.
They're isolated, exactly, but existing on the same Windows machine and also be able to be activated at the same time in different terminals or different shells.
Correct.
Yeah, that's necessary because some of the applications of ROS 2, they need to communicate with applications of ROS 1, so we need to have this connection.
That's correct.
And just a small, then can I ask you,
Sure.
how do they work? Does it exist a ROS bridge in Windows? You know the ROS bridge, ROS 1 bridge, okay? ROS 1 bridge is a program in ROS for Linux that allows you to communicate ROS 2 programs with ROS 1 programs. Does it exist?
Yes, it does.
Okay.
And it works just as fine.
Okay, great to know. I had no idea that was already ported to Windows. Great.
Sure. So what we had enabled in ROS 1 was the core of ROS. So the things that are owned by Open Robotics, we made those work on Windows.
Okay.
Now, the ROS ecosystem is tens of thousands of nodes with even more dependencies. So it's not really feasible for one organization to port all of those behaviors. So what we did was we took a look and we said, we're going to light up some manipulation and some mobility to help bootstrap the ecosystem.
Yeah, I see.
During that process, we've identified some patterns of what does it mean to support Windows, and we've also minimized the amount of change that you need in order to support Windows.
Okay.
In fact, I'm actually surprised at the number of ROS nodes that just compile
On Windows?
and work on Windows.
Okay, so many of the already existing applications for Linux, let's say some of them, you mentioned many, so can I say many? Many of them, then they can be downloaded to Windows?
Well, the source code can.
Yeah. The source code. Okay, so you do a Git clone of that, and then you can compile them with minimal modifications in Windows. So it's kind of, there is a lot of already work there that it's very likely that it will work in Windows already.
For many packages.
For many packages. Okay.
Now,
Great.
there are a number of packages where the person who wrote the package, or the group that wrote the package, took some, made some source code dependencies on Linux. Yeah. So things like path and making assumptions about how paths are combined. And then there are a class of bugs around where the Microsoft compiler actually will find bugs that the other compilers don't. And we also have, we found some where there's implicit assumptions about libraries that are imported that should have been specified that are required on Windows. So there's a formula for many general porting.
Okay.
ROS nodes are also typically made up of external dependencies. Okay, so one of the things we've done is we've actually enlightened ROS dep to look for binary dependencies on Chocolatey. Now, if you're not familiar with Chocolatey, it's a package manager that works just like apt-get on Linux, on Ubuntu. So it will look to a repository by name and then pull that binary package down, explode it into the environment, and then allow you to use it. So it'll look for binary deployments. It will look to a private feed from Microsoft and the public feed. If it doesn't find that, then it will look through a secondary feed for a library manager that we call VCPack. So VCPack is an open source recipe manager for libraries. So when an appropriate connection is made between the name in ROS and VCPack, ROS steps will actually reach out to the repository, pull down the recipe, pull down the source code, apply patches, and build it so that your code will actually link up to it. So we try to make it really easy, and we're looking now to identify the common libraries that do not have binary distributions.
Okay, that's a huge work that you have. I am sorry that you have so much work on that.
You know, what we're finding is that there are most of those have common dependencies.
Yeah.
So we do think that there's at some point we're going to get the majority of those.
Yeah, okay, I see, that's right. And also, in my opinion, I think that ROS for Windows is relatively new, so still people is like we have on our mind, the ROS developers we have in our mind about developing for Linux, but I suspect that as this continues to have a version for ROS and this necessity for having a system running in both Linux and Windows, so ROS both for Linux and for Windows, then I suspect that the developers we will figure out a way of creating our applications in a way that those changes for one version of the operating system or the other are not necessary. Like these dependencies for looking into the paths in the file system that you mentioned at the beginning.
Correct.
So there will be a wrapper function that we can use, and then automatically changes. If you compile in Linux, then it will get the code compilation will be one, and then if you compile in Windows, the same thing will generate a different code that is according to the Windows file system and structure.
Yeah, if you use standard library and Boost for
that's right. It's already. That's right. I didn't think about that. So then it will be a way of educating the developers on using those instead of very, very specific for Linux. Yeah. So I think that it will come. It will come. Just it needs some more time and seeing the benefits that if I can create an application for ROS that can run only on Linux machines, then if I can do it available for Windows also at the same time with almost no code, no change code in my case, then I will do it because I can reach more people. And actually, by using those libraries, it doesn't need to change my code, so it only needs to change my mind when I am developing the application. So decide to use those Boost libraries for it.
Yep.
Okay. Yeah.
So.
Okay. Just a thought that gone over my mind. I'm just listening to you. Okay. And let me see the questions. I want to serve with you. So So that's what you have shown on the last year. So what has improved in the version of ROS that we have this year at the ROSCon 2019?
So as we've been working on increasing the amount of support on Windows, we're also taking a look at where can we add value on top of Linux and Windows. Okay, so that once we get to that critical mass on Windows and Windows, ROS 2, there's that layer of things that Microsoft can bring to the table.
Okay.
So we've actually are very passionate about developer experience. So one of the things that we've invested heavily into is the ROS Visual Studio Code extension. Now, the ROS Visual Studio Code extension started off as a community project by an engineer who asked us to take it over. So we pulled it into a Microsoft repository and have been adding tons of features to it. We originally started by adding support for Windows, but we've also added things like ROS core management, URDF preview, so as you're editing the XML for URDF or Zacro, it uses ROS web tools to show it in line.
Yeah, I see this. Very, very nice.
As of last week, we added support for ROS launch debugging. So from a launch script, you can do ROS launch and have the debugger automatically connect to C++ or Python. Okay. We've also ensured that the ROS Visual Studio Code extension works well on both Windows and Linux. So you don't have to choose. You can just use the VS Code for both cases.
For both systems.
Yeah. We also just recently added ROS 2 support, so it'll detect the workspace and load the appropriate workspace. So
Nice.
yeah, we're really excited about this one. It's a labor of love, and we are constantly adding features as we are make progress. Yeah. So one of the things that we're looking at, or we've seen, is many customers will run a VM, a Linux VM, on Windows to do compilation for a Linux-based robot.
Okay.
So one of the things that we're looking at doing is making it so that Visual Studio Code can run natively on Windows, and then use the Windows subsystem for Linux to do cross-compile, remote deploy, and then remote debug.
Wow, that
so
would
that
be
you can,
useful.
Yeah, I think it'll be fun.
Yeah.
And then set up the environment so that RViz and RViz, RQT, any of those tools can actually remote monitor the robot. So setting up the appropriate ROS masters and things like that, and make it work on both ROS 1 and ROS 2.
Yeah.
So that's one of the projects that
you're working at present. When can we expect one version of this?
We're currently prototyping it to understand what the model is, and we'll write it up publicly on the VS Code ROS GitHub, so that if other people want to help contribute to that, we welcome pull requests. So that's a preview of things that we'd like to work on in the near future.
Okay, great. And remember, listeners, that you listen to this at the ROS Developers Podcast. Okay, that's a premium news, or I don't know how to say it. Breaking news. Let's say that's what they say in the States. Yeah, breaking news.
Breaking news.
Breaking news. Yeah? Okay, great. And then, what about the Windows versions that are supported, that support ROS?
So we have enabled ROS and test ROS frequently on Windows 10. So that's Windows 10 Home, Pro, and Enterprise. But we also have a version of Windows called IoT Enterprise. Windows 10 IoT Enterprise. The IoT Enterprise is a full version of Windows, but it's licensed for dedicated purpose devices. And you'll find it in everything from ATMs to gas pumps to robots. And now, so ROS is supported for development machines as well as deployments.
Now that you mentioned about this IoT, I've seen in the latest months a lot of talk about using IoT technologies in robotics. And I think that this kind of IoTs, I don't see in practical life too much application in real life. I mean, but I think that they're kind of shifting towards robotics or something. Do you feel like this, or is just my impression?
So IoT, one of the benefits of IoT is that it uses open protocols and open standards to tie devices together. In many industrial applications in the past, there were proprietary stacks, and there was a lot of gluing things together with different protocols, gluing different protocols. So in industrial IoT scenarios, there's a lot of research and a lot of cooperation going on to leverage the ideas of IoT and applying them to industrial systems. And today, a lot of IoT is about transmitting data off to something, whether it's an edge solution or a cloud solution. One of the things that we're looking at is, well, how do you close the loop? How do you turn IoT into a control system? How do you leverage that data, inference on that data, and then reapply it? Now, a robot is the ultimate closed-loop control.
Yes, exactly.
Okay, so we have nested closed-loop control all the way down from your encoders on the motors and managing speed, through the looping back of getting data off your sensors to understand the environment, to reason about it, to make a decision, create a plan, execute it. That's another closed-loop control. That's where a lot of solutions kind of stop. But there's actually a bigger one, which is how do the robots operate as a part of a larger closed-loop control, cooperating together, generating the data, and closing the loop. Because ultimately, you're trying to do something with the robot. How do
Yeah.
you participate in that closed loop control?
Oh.
So that's the autonomous systems
Okay.
portion.
Okay, I didn't have this vision before. Okay, now that's very clarifying, and now I understand that interest in the IoT technologies and moving into robotics. I see. Oh, that's very very interesting. Thank you for that information because I didn't know. I didn't have it. So then I have a question here about the installation methods that you provide in order to install ROS on Windows. So how do we install? How can we install? Is there a single method? Are there any several methods like I don't know, natively install ROS as another application of Windows, or do we have to install a virtual machine? And I don't know. So can you explain us?
Absolutely. So we are releasing ROS through a package manager called Chocolatey, which we mentioned.
Yes. I don't know.
Essentially, it's a zip file with a manifest.
Okay.
So during the install process, you point the Chocolatey package manager, which needs to be installed separately, to a repository that we have. It pulls down the binaries and installs it into a directory that is known at build time.
Okay.
Okay, so we have declared that the build is going to be installed into c:\opt.
Okay.
Okay, so
Yeah, very similar to Linux. Yes.
we're trying to minimize the delta.
Great.
So that actually turns out to maybe not be the best solution. So what we've heard from some of our customers is that they actually want a IT managed way of deploying ROS on Windows. Because the reason why they want to use Windows is because their IT is managing that as a device in their ecosystem. So we are currently providing a portion of a workaround, which is during our build process, we create a self-extracting zip file. It still deploys to c:\opt, but it is something that can be independently virus scanned and hosted on an IT infrastructure and then deployed through machine deployment.
Okay. Good.
We are evaluating other ways of doing this, such that you can maintain the modularity and of something like Chocolatey, but also marry it to IT systems. So we're still working on these alternative deployment solutions, but for today, for development, we recommend the Chocolatey install.
Yeah, for the typical ROS developer. That is a ROS developer, let's say an independent guy, or maybe as a student, a researcher, that he is wanted to use ROS on Windows for his next project, then he will have to use this tool that you call
Chocolatey.
Chocolatey. Okay, I will put a link on the show notes to this tool so that people can know better, and also myself, because I don't know how to use it. Then with that is so that's the process, the typical process that you will recommend to those guys.
Correct. Yes.
Okay, great. Then no more virtual machines necessary in Windows for using ROS.
That's correct. So for ROS development on a Windows machine, it's natively installed.
Is natively installed, exactly.
We also do provide a VM in Azure, so that you can run a development VM in the cloud.
In the cloud, yeah.
And then you can actually expand the number of GPUs, so that if you may have a lower end laptop or lower end development laptop or lower end development system, you can create a cloud virtual machine and use that for development as well.
Okay, that's for the case of executing that in a cloud.
Yes.
That is based on Windows. For the listeners who doesn't know, Azure is the cloud system that Microsoft provides. Yeah. Okay. Great. So this question is about how to issue commands into a Windows machine. You know, because I'm based in Linux from ever, and then for me, Windows is like a system for computers that uses Windows, and as the name says, so it's a graphical application. But in Linux, we have the terminal that is like the basic stuff, and then we use that a lot for developing in robotics. We issue the commands ROS launch, ROS topic, or this type in a terminal. So how do we do that in Windows? For the Linux users, we don't know how to do it. How do we do that?
So in Windows, there is a terminal called Command Prompt, and it's available on all versions of Windows. When you install Visual Studio, which installs the Visual Studio toolchain, which contains the compiler and core libraries, as well as the development environment, it does install a launch point that associates the command prompt with the toolchain. Okay, so when you install ROS on Windows, one of the things that you do is install Visual Studio, and then you use the Visual Studio command prompt, which really is just the Windows command prompt with some environment set up.
I see.
And that points to the toolchain.
Okay.
Once you do that, then you run ROS commands, actually just like you would in Linux.
Okay.
So catkin make, rqt, ROS launch, ROS. Those tools are the same tools. Built from the same sources on Windows.
Okay.
So once you load the command prompt. Now, I'm really excited that Microsoft is in the process of releasing a next generation command prompt called Windows Terminal, and it's super cool. It's super cool to work with. I mean, from a Windows person, you're probably going to look at it and go, yeah, I've been able to do that forever. But from a Windows side, it actually brings a lot of the things I love about Linux terminals to Windows. So there is a next generation terminal coming, and we have documentation on the ROS install on how to use it.
Get it. Okay. Wow, that's exciting news here that we are getting at the ROSCon with the Microsoft team. And then, if I have understood correctly with your explanation, so Windows, there are like two ways of issuing commands in Windows. The first one that you mentioned is this prompt that comes with the Windows itself when you install. But that, let's say, that is a primitive tool or very basic tool. Yeah. Then the real thing is the one that comes when you install Visual Studio, and then it shows a prompt that has all the power.
So there's. Sorry for the confusion. There is there is a command prompt in Windows.
Yes.
There's the Visual Studio customization of that command prompt.
Okay, customization of that.
And then a new command prompt is coming.
Yeah,
that's available as a preview. Yeah.
Okay. Then the Visual Studio, what it does is to, let's say, put the command prompt of Windows on steroids. Can we say that?
Sure.
Okay. So then it's highly recommended, but no, actually it is mandatory when you install ROS that this Visual Studio is going to get installed also.
If you're doing development, yes, because it requires the development tool chains.
Yeah.
If you're just using like RViz for visualizing a robot, you don't necessarily need to install the Visual Studio.
Okay.
So, for example, we've seen cases where we have robot wranglers in the factory who are managing robots on the factory floor who just need to be able to access RViz and point that at a robot. And in that case, we actually provide both the chocolatey install or the zip file method I've mentioned, which doesn't require Visual Studio. So if you just need to run visualizers, it's not necessary.
Okay, very clarifying. Okay, great. Then I had a question here about if we had to adapt the code from Linux, for ROS for Linux, but you already answered that at the beginning of the interview, so I think that it's okay. So let's go to the question about Gazebo on Windows. What is the state? Can we launch Gazebo simulations?
Yes, you can.
Okay, so I'm asking you this question because I went to the page of Gazebo, the official documentation on Gazebo. I don't know if it's outdated or something, but it says that this doesn't work on Windows. It was saying there is a sentence there at the beginning. Okay, so I'm telling you some information that you don't know.
We will go get that fixed.
Yes. So it's on the Gazebo official documentation page. Okay, so maybe it's updated, maybe it's a mistake, or maybe I misunderstood myself. So that's possible. So what's the status of Gazebo in Windows?
So Gazebo works on Windows.
Great.
Those
are good news.
I didn't know that there was some documentation out there. We are looking to find cases where there's official documentation that says something's not supported, and we're working to update it. And we are working with other middleware providers and others who have documentation where we know something works, and saying, hey, have you tried it, and let them know that it works, or update it for them. So we are working through that. But it's a giant ecosystem. There's a lot available. So yes, Gazebo does work. We have seen there's a couple of issues inside of Gazebo that we are working on. One is the fetching of resources directly from the web uses tarballs, which there isn't an API on Windows to unpack tarballs. And then there's sometimes we see a crash in the spawner that we haven't identified yet. But in general, it works just fine. And we are working through some issues that we've seen.
Okay, and do you know about this new version that they are preparing at Open Robotics of Gazebo, the next generation? Let's say it's the one based on the ignition libraries. They call kind of blueprint. Do you know about that?
Yes, we do.
And are you targeting this to support? Are you doing any work to adapt this into Windows, or what is the status of that?
So we haven't currently been working on that on the next generation Gazebo, but we will look into it.
Okay.
Absolutely.
So we'll see that supported also in Windows. Okay, great. And then one question is about the versions that you are supporting, because I didn't ask you that. I'm amazed that I didn't ask you about which ROS versions are supported in Windows, both in ROS 1 and ROS 2. Which ones?
So we started off with Melodic. So
directly on Melodic.
Yeah, okay. Melodic is the earliest version that we have lit up and said that is the one we're targeting. It is the latest LTS from Open Robotics, the long-term service.
That's right.
So we started off with that one, and we'll support it forward. We had some work this sprint, or this last month, to do noetic support. So when that's released, we'll have noetic builds. In fact, we actually have pre-noetic builds available today.
Okay.
As far as on ROS 2, Open Robotics has enabled ROS 2 on Windows since at the very beginning, and we are working with Open Robotics as well. We have dashing builds available as a chocolatey package that coexists with ROS 1, and eloquent builds as well.
Okay. Well, great. So everything's supported. The latest status of ROS, so it's everything supported in Windows. Okay, so then I think Windows is actually a real option for ROS developers.
I certainly hope so. Now, I would love for people to reach out and say, give us positives and negatives if they actually hit any issues. We have seen some environmental concerns where the environment that people have from their existing systems might collide with ROS, and we're working to identify cases where people have tried to install ROS and have failed because of some environmental conflict. Okay. And we're working to identify what those conflicts are and ways to detect them and resolve them, or provide solutions for customers to work around if they're incompatible for some reason. Okay. So if your customers or if listeners do hit issues, let us know. We have a GitHub issues where we're called ms-iot/ROS on Windows is where we're collecting ROS issues. So if you do hit something where I tried to run a tool and I got a missing DLL or this tool crashed, we're looking to identify any of those issues, because we really do want to make this a good experience for people.
Okay, so I will put a link to this repo and this issues tracker on the show notes of the podcast. So the people, if you are trying this you decide to try Windows, ROS for Windows, and find any problem for your specific case, then you can go there and indicate, and then Lou will read all of them and then send his team to solve the. No, I don't know. So how do you develop? How many people is at Microsoft developing?
So we have, I like to call it a ragtag fugitive fleet of development teams around Microsoft, and we're all working together on a shared robotics vision. We have groups in our AI team, in our what we call cognition. We have Edge Robotics. We have a cloud team. So we have a number of different groups that we're all collaborating together. In the Edge Robotics team, my team, I'm a dev lead, and I have 2 reports right now.
Okay.
And we also have a PM team as well, and what we call data and intelligence team members. So on the development side, we have 3 engineers on the Edge Robotics team. Plus, we have a number of partner teams who are contributing resource or contributing time and energy to supporting ROS on Windows.
Okay. So yeah, so send him the questions and the issues that you find, and his team, they will take charge of that and solve
Absolutely.
it. Great. And then I want to ask you about this. What is your opinion about ROS for Windows for which sector of the community of robotics is more suited? So do you think that ROS for Windows is fitting for the whole range of different developers, like independent developers or education developers or researchers, or in the people that is working at a company? For which one of those do you think that ROS for Windows is more suited?
So I'll answer your question, but I wanted to prefix this with a little bit of context.
Sure.
We want to reduce the friction for adopting ROS on Windows. That's our goal. So whoever wants to use it has as little friction as possible. Okay? It's a tool in the tool chest.
Yeah, I see.
So a system integrator, for example, who is working to bring a robot into an environment, they might find that the environment involves Windows.
Yeah.
So we want to make sure that they have the tool in their tool chest to bring a robot with Windows into that environment.
Oh, okay. I see.
So that's really the meta point I wanted to make.
Makes sense.
That said, we started this project for education and makers. I'm a maker myself. I was a dev lead in the maker team. And we have the signal that we got was actually from a lot of industrial, warehousing, medical scenarios where they are largely Windows deployments, but they want to bring more automation, physical automation, into their environments. So a lot of our focus has actually been on the industrial side, and enabling industrial customers. Industrial is the hardest thing to do, so there's a lot of secondary benefits of addressing industrial first. That said, we're not discounting education, we're not discounting hobbyists, we're not discounting makers, researchers, academics. Those are all, we want to make sure that there is as minimal friction as possible.
Okay, that makes sense. Yeah. So with the reframing that you made, that I think it clarifies. So it's just by minimizing this friction to entry. So if those guys, they are used to do more on Windows, then it will be easier for them to go into ROS using the Windows. So I seen that this. So then my question is about which sector will be better suited to use ROS for Windows. I think that should reframe. It's a change again, and it's, I wouldn't say which sector, but which country. I would say which country, because in my experience, by traveling on the different countries, I have seen that, for example, in Europe, researchers, they use a lot more Linux, the researchers themselves, for their experiments with robots. But in Asia, I have seen that a lot of the researchers, they use Windows for their research. So they have a problem on using ROS, they get frustrated for that. Do you have the same feeling, or is just my appreciation?
So amusingly, we have a GDPR compliant telemetry on the back end. So when people download packages, we can see which countries in general that are coming from.
Okay.
And the only country where we haven't seen downloads is Antarctica.
Antarctica.
I'm still. So if you're listening from Antarctica, I'd love for you to try downloading it.
Okay.
I gotta collect them all, right?
Yes.
But there's been downloads all over the world, and there's a shocking number of downloads. So pretty amazing. We've had a lot more people reaching out to us from. Actually, I think we've had people reaching out all over the world. But
so you don't see this pattern that I mentioned.
I don't necessarily see the pattern, because I think a lot of researchers or a lot of people who are adopting are using Linux because that's what they needed to in order to use ROS.
Yes. Yeah.
But now we have another tool in their tool chest should they want to or need to use Windows.
Yeah, I see. Okay, so in that case, I can tell you that I have experience on participating at the ROSCON. RoboCup competition.
Mm-hmm.
It's do you know about this competition?
Yes.
Yeah, the RoboCup competition is about. In this case, was about using ROS is on robots for home. So it was RoboCup at home. The competition is a sub-league of the main RoboCup competition.
Right.
And there we had to use robots for doing tasks at the home, at a simulated home. I mean, a real home, but in the competition area. And for that, most of the teams, I would say 99% of the teams, we were using Linux in our robots. But then when those people from Japan specifically, I'm talking about Japan, that they were using Windows in their machine. So for us, it was kind of shocking. Like, wow, you're controlling the robot in Windows. You know, they were not using ROS, of course. They were, at that time, it was like maybe 5 years ago, so 5-6 years ago. So they were using their own system there. And then since then, I have been watching other competitions, or when we go to the conferences, and found that many people, many researchers and robotics, they have their computer, their laptop on Windows. But more in European people, so we do have more Linux in our machine. Just that's my experience. I don't know.
Well, so our commitment is that any ROS nodes that we produce, where it doesn't necessarily require Windows, we support on both Linux and Windows.
Okay.
One of the things we're demonstrating here is the Azure Connect, which is the next generation of Connect. You might be familiar with Connect 1 and Connect 2. This would essentially be Connect v3.
Okay.
The ROS node that was built for that runs on Linux, and the drivers are available for Linux as well.
Oh, okay.
So, and we test on Linux all the time. We have one of the maintainers from Zurich runs Linux as the primary solution. So it's not an or, it's an and.
Okay. Great clarification. So let me go for the last question now, because of already the time. Then let's go for the plans of the future versions of ROS for Windows. So what will we see on the next ROSCON in 2020?
Well, we'll see. However, what our goal is that we want to make sure that Windows gets to a point, ROS 1 on Windows gets to a point that it can be adopted and deployed for customers who need it today, and then focus on ROS 2 and make sure that ROS 2 on Windows is great. And then we're going to build that, work on things that are appropriate for both Linux and Windows.
Okay. So that they are kind of, they work seamless. They don't know. Those nodes, they don't know where are they running.
It doesn't, at that point, we want to make sure that whatever Microsoft is producing works across both Linux and Windows. Yeah.
Okay.
So, although I can't pre-announce anything,
that would be great for us,
wouldn't it? But yeah. So our goal is to get it up to the point where you don't have to decide, reduce the friction, and make it so that they're both first-class citizens.
Okay. Well, maybe next year we'll interview again Lou, and then we'll see the news of ROS for Windows and at the ROSCon 2020.
Sounds good.
Okay, thank you very much, Lou, for your interview, all the questions and all the information that you shared with us.
I appreciate it. Thank you for having me.
Thank you all the ROS developers that are listening, and please, I would like to finish the podcast by asking you to leave us a review in iTunes, telling us what you think about the podcast and what you would like to have also. And thank you very much if you can give us 5 stars in iTunes. That's all for today. See you next week with a new lesson from the experts. And until then, keep pushing your ROS learning.
Developers, podcast.